Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. I want to talk about addiction because it's a especially insidious disease, a chronic disease that devastates people and those they love. William Cope Moyers and his mother Judith Moyers know only too well how overwhelming it can be. They share their story wherever they can, and they're my guests today. Welcome.
Thank you.
And it is a family disease, isn't it?
Definitely.
Family and community and personal. William, tell us, let's start with what is an addiction? What is addiction? What does it mean?
Addiction, it is a chronic illness, Ronnie. It's a disease, as you said, that is insidious because it affects everybody. It doesn't discriminate. Usually when we talk about addiction to alcohol and other drugs, and we talk about people who use those substances to the detriment of everything that matters to them. Addiction is a disease that hijacks the brain and steals the soul and affects families from the inner part of the city to the quiet suburbs and families like the Moyers.
It affects everybody. I mean, any kind of, from whatever backgrounds, whatever profession, whatever anything. What it always has been, and we always hear impersonal things about don't take drugs, abstinence is the answer, but we haven't always, and what's so wonderful about you people is really heard from people what it's like and how horrible it is and how totally taken aback and surprised you were when you were faced with it.
Shocked. We could not imagine that our beautiful, wonderful, smart, good-looking son had a problem like this, and we didn't know it until he was 30 years old. It wasn't as if it was a teenage thing. Yeah. We didn't know it. And we wondered, Bill and I wondered, how in the world could that be? That we're informed journalists, we work in the world of information, and we didn't really know anything about it.
It's amazing. How old were you when you started abusing something? Is that how the terminology?
Well, I don't ever like to use the word abusing because abusing suggests a behavior. And to the contrary, I never abused substances. I love them.
You love them. So
I
that's
love
interesting.
Them. I began to use or experiment with substances when I was 15 or 16 years old, growing up in the suburbs of Long Island, not from a broken family, not from a family
a highly achieving family.
Highly achieving, successful, loving family, engaged parents, good brother and sister, good schools. I began to experiment like a lot of teenagers do with marijuana, and I began to legally drink at the age of 18. In 1976, 77. But what I discovered, Ronnie, was that substances did for me what I could not do for myself, which was to placate or mitigate or medicate my sense that I wasn't good enough or that I needed to be better than. And I think that's one of the characteristics of addiction is that it helps in a perverse way. It helps somebody feel more comfortable in their own skin. So I began to use substances even while I continued to thrive as a young journalist and as a student in school. And it wasn't long, though, before I began to spiral down into that abyss that about 1 in 10 of us experiences. Which
but you know, it's not only because you're not thrilled with what you're doing or what you think about yourself. It really, I mean, that would imply that you're starting below a certain line to get up. It also happens to people who are doing fine.
And I was doing fine in other ways.
And I think the point that you made was it's not abusive because you felt really good.
I liked it.
It made you feel better.
I used it. I used it like a lot of people do. The difference, though, is, and what we learn later on, is that my brain processes those substances differently than the rest of the majority of the population. That's why when my parents did the series on addiction close to home in 1998, they explained the science of addiction in a way that was through the bodies of people like myself. I used substances voluntarily. What they did to me and where they took me became an involuntary spiral downward into the abyss.
Did you discuss it a lot? Were you hesitant to do that series, what you did in 1998? When Williams first started, when was it, 1994?
89.
89, here in Harlem.
So I went and got him out of a crack house. And I didn't even know
I didn't
know what a crack house was, and I just knew that he was missing, so to speak, for several days, and his wife had called me and said, I'm very worried. And
you didn't call the police?
No, I called my lawyer and said, can you help me track him? There are there are 150 police departments on Long Island, something like 140, 150. And so, you know how lawyers can do it. They checked with all those police departments. He hadn't been picked up. He checked with the hospitals.
Did you suspect that he was something to do with alcohol or drugs?
No,
No.
I still didn't. Can you imagine? And I thought that something terrible had happened to him. He was hit on the head by somebody, and then he lost.
Yeah.
He didn't know where he was or what he was doing. I wanted to think that, I'm sure, unconsciously. So Bill was out of town, so our lawyer, Bill Josephson, and I went looking, and he also knew how to track a phone call. And William did call his wife.
From a payphone up in Harlem.
And we tracked that, and we went to Harlem, and we drove around till we saw his car. How fortunate and lucky was that? And then we got out of that car and we looked for him, and we eventually found him after a very hot day in Harlem.
And he came with you?
He didn't want to. No, he didn't come with us. But when I confronted him at the front door of that apartment house, he said, "I'm all right." And I said, "I think you're not all right. Would you come with me?" And he said, "No." And so our friend Bill Josephson said, "Well, talk to me about this. Judith, you go get in the car," which I did. And William said, "I'll follow you home. Follow us home to Long Island." And high, of course, he was high. But that was another fortunate thing. He got there in one piece. He got home.
And then I got home, Ronnie, and my parents, nobody knew what to do with me. I mean, they began to sort of, I think, understand that I had this problem, but what do you do about it? The now what that I talk about in my book.
Yeah. After talking with his wife that night and getting some sleep, he took himself into St. Vincent's Hospital and walked in.
Psych ward.
Psych ward, and said, "Would you please lock me up?"
And that started the sort of peeling away the layers of, whether you want to call it denial or
So when you
ignorance.
left there, what did you think? That you were fine?
You know,
This
I
wasn't
really
gonna
thought,
happen,
I thought I
and
had
you
an
were gonna be
acute
good.
problem that I did not understand the nature of my illness. I did not realize it's chronic. I had an opportunity to go to Hazelden out in Minnesota, where I happen to work now, and we have a facility here in New York. We didn't at the time, but I went out to Minnesota.
So you did go to Minnesota right
I
after
went to
that.
Minnesota after psych ward.
30 days. Were you 30 days at St. Vincent's? How long
Couple
was it?
weeks, in
Yeah,
August of '89.
Several weeks.
And I got out there and I said, "Oh, well, this will be easy to do." It's kind of, I saw my addiction as I would see a broken arm. It's a problem. It needs to be fixed. And then you just move on. I didn't realize it's not like that.
We thought that too.
Yeah.
The way we found Hazelden, we had never heard of Hazelden or any other place. We had no idea. Bill had an alcoholic uncle, and I had an alcoholic brother-in-law, and that's what we knew about it.
But you also noted someplace in the book that if there was somebody who was addicted to something in your
Family
in your
tree.
history, in your family tree, that you're particularly susceptible?
Absolutely. We know from what science and researchers are telling us that addiction is, there's a genetic predisposition. It doesn't mean that if you come from an alcoholic family, you're necessarily going to become an alcoholic, but the risks are much greater. My children, for example, are far greater at risk for addiction than are their peers at school, because not only are they the product of one alcoholic parent, me, but also their mother is an
Judith,
alcoholic.
I didn't mean to cut you off.
No.
What was it like to be out there? You were out in a drug treatment facility.
Yeah, well,
And you were part of it.
right. Bill and I, as I say, we didn't know what to do, and we didn't want to tell anybody. We didn't want to ask anybody. The stigma was huge. But finally, my mentor on Long Island, Ann Maluk, 10 years older than I, had 5 sons, and she had helped to set up a counseling center in Garden City. And I called her. She had an MSW degree, and I called her, and I told her, and she said, "I'm ashamed I haven't ever told you. I have 2 sons out of my 5 who went to a place called Hazelden out in Minnesota, and I highly recommend it. That's the first time I ever heard the word. And that's where we got in touch with them and found out what we could do. And we thought, just what you thought, that it was like a broken arm. It could be fixed. We went to the family program because that's really important. We needed a lot of help with this. And it would have been wonderful if our other children could have gone too, but they were adults and they had jobs and so on. Our other son did finally go for the family program.
How long were you there for the family program?
Just about a week, wasn't it? Something like that. And the first thing they told us, very first day, was about relapse. And I said to myself, not my son.
Right.
My son is great. He runs marathons. He's very disciplined. He plays musical instruments. He plays, he's just great. He's perfect. He's a perfect person. And he'll just get on top of this right away. I really did think that.
And you hoped it too, probably.
I hoped it and thought it. I believed it.
parents
I had no doubt in my head at that point that there was any chance of relapse, but we learned better.
But the relapse was very important to your recovery, wasn't it?
Well, they became teachable moments, and I think what's really important in
It
relapse.
wasn't just one relapse.
No, I had multiple relapses. I was in treatment 4 times over 5 years, Ronnie, before I finally learned in 1994 that I needed to take personal responsibility, not for the problem anymore, but for the solution. You know, we always say this at Hazelden, and I tell parents and other addicts and alcoholics and viewers on television programs, I always say all the time that there is no cure for addiction, but there is a solution, and that solution starts with the addict, the alcoholic.
Does the family not play a part in that solution?
Well, I'm really lucky. It should. It should, and my family has always supported me, even though there were lots of moments when you were pretty angry, I think, and frustrated and scared.
Frustration, I think, is the word. Oh, my goodness.
But I was fortunate.
worried.
My parents and my family at the end said, you know what, Moyers, you better take responsibility for this. You know, we love you. We hate your illness. We love you, but we can't fix you, and you need to take responsibility. So I had the support. Unfortunately, because of the illness, because addicts and alcoholics tend to do the opposite of what they feel. I mean, they just are reverse when they're under the influence. It drives families away. We always talk about this in our own family and at Hazelden and a lot of treatment programs, that addiction is a disease that affects all of the family, and so it's all the family's responsibility to recover from it.
We have to take care of we learned right away that, well, not right away, took a couple of rounds to learn that we couldn't fix him.
You've got those 3 C's.
Didn't cause it, can't control it, and can't cure it. And, you know, I'm a professional fixer. As a television producer, I fix things. That's what we do.
Right.
And I've made a nice living being a television producer, and I like to fix other things. I like to fix food, fix gardens.
And you're a mother, and you like to fix.
And she's good at it.
And I'm really, really good at fixing. But what I had to learn, and it was only through 12-step programs and therapy and so on, that I could not fix people. This was miserable for me to have to learn. And once we sort of let go, stepped back, and said, you know, we support you, but we can't do it. And there are boundaries. There are places we can't go.
So, now you talked about your friend who then directed you to Hazelden and said, I haven't told you this, but I have 2 sons. That shows how important the community is, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
It's reminding me of sisterhood, the women's movement, everything. The supportive, you need to have supportive communities. And
I always say that addiction is a disease of isolation, and the antidote to it is community, family, the we.
yeah. So tell me what you do. You work for Hazelden.
I work for Hazelden. I'm based in Minnesota. I live there, although I grew up in New York. I love living in Minnesota. We're based there, but we have a wonderful facility here in the metropolitan New York area. We have Collegiate Recovery Housing as well, down in Tribeca, and then we have services all over the country. But what my role has morphed into over the years, in part because of my family support, and because we have been so public, is that I'm an advocate for people who are still struggling and still suffering. I'm an advocate for families that don't know what to do. I'm somebody who tries to change public perception and change public policy around addiction. I argue all the time that addiction is the #1 health problem in New York and in this country, and that we need to do more in terms of prevention, treatment, and aftercare services than we need to do in terms of the war on drugs, which has been a failure.
That's one of the things Hazelden does in New York. We have a wonderful aftercare facility where there's outpatient care. That's in Chelsea. And anybody can call that up if they want to. And now, for the last year and a half, we've had collegiate housing for young people who are any university student who's matriculated in the New York area, and there are 500,000 students about in this area. Anybody who's been to treatment, I believe, and who's sober can apply to live in that house. You can imagine what it would be like to come out of treatment and go live in a dorm. It would be the worst thing in the world I could think of.
You know, my grandchildren are beginning to go to college, and so we hear stories about all the drinking on campus. The war on drugs, as you said, has not been successful. I'm not talking about importing drugs. We're now talking about the use of drugs, right? Well, what are we going to do? What is the public policy for it? It's a public health #1 issue. How can we make it equivalent to smoking, for instance?
Well, in part by getting people who have been affected by this illness, the Moyers family and others across the spectrum, to stand up and speak out and say this is the face of addiction and this is how it affects people. We need to develop a constituency movement in New York and across the country like we have with other illnesses, HIV/AIDS, depression, breast cancer. We need a march for the cure, not that there's a cure yet, but we need to raise awareness, and we need to shift away from a punitive policy perspective to one that does see this as a chronic health problem that, with personal responsibility, people can recover from.
And it's not just about the person who's addicted. It's about the people around them and the importance of early education early on. You say, what do you tell your kids?
I tell my kids my story, and I let them know that you can experiment with substances growing up and you may not develop the problem, but you can experiment with substances and you may develop the problem. And what I always leave my children with, and what I say in schools all the time, which is this: if you choose to use and you develop a problem, it is okay to ask for help. We don't talk about this illness in that context, which is to say, you know what, it's okay to ask for help. And it is, just like any other illness.
You know, I think that was one of the mistakes we made. We try not to focus too much on the mistakes we made with our children. They're all sort of experimental, aren't they? But one of the mistakes we made, that the only real discussion we had around the family table was of the bad things that bad alcoholics did, because we had these two people that we knew well, my brother-in-law, Bill's uncle, who were typical alcoholics. You had to go get them out of jail. They couldn't keep a job, etc. And we always said, isn't that sad? And you certainly don't want to do that, and you don't want to be like them.
Right.
And so I think what we painted the picture is, for our children, if I had a problem, I wouldn't tell my parents, and they didn't.
See, and so it's almost like have a mammogram on a regular basis, or the pap tests that we used to do, or what other kind. I mean, but it should be part of our culture.
And our
To
conversation.
say that there are ways. If you have this and you think you're in trouble, there are ways, and it's not something terrible to ask for help. Right?
You remember when Betty Ford stood up and
Yeah.
said she had an addiction problem, she
Right.
went for treatment. That shocked people. A first lady, and she was a very courageous woman to have done that, and it really changed things. And then Mrs. Rockefeller talked about her breast cancer.
That's right.
And when she used the word breast on television, people,
Everybody went,
you know, but it changed things so that you could talk about it. HIV was another one of those. In the beginning, people did not mention this. Doctors didn't even write it down on their pad there. Now, of course, you can talk about it anywhere.
So we have to take the shame away from it.
That's right. We have to talk about it just like we do any other illness, and we have to put a face on it, a human face, with real names, with real people, standing up and speaking out, not just about the problem, Ronnie, but also about the solution. And the solution for a lot of us includes, as I said, personal responsibility and treatment, and then continuing to maintain our recoveries in ways that have resulted in me being able to stay clean and sober for 19 years now.
You cite the 12-step program.
I use the 12-step program. It's a good pathway for lots and lots of people. There are thousands of meetings in New York and across the country, but there are many ways that people can recover. I'm not going to say that one way works better than another, but I do know that the 12 steps are a wonderful way for a lot of people to recover from a seemingly hopeless condition.
And a supporter, somebody you can call when you need help, right?
You need to have the we of the program.
It's good for families too. Yeah, I go to a 12-step program too, and have since 1989, and it's amazing what group support will do. Just when you think, I really can't do this, you know, then in the group, other people tell about their
course you
ups
can.
and
Yeah,
downs.
right.
And
We've
you
done
can
it.
do
Yeah, you can.
The key is to be able to do it publicly, to be able to talk like we are right now, openly about
and
this
to
illness.
get the help. For people like you, the fixer, it's very hard, wasn't it, to ask people for help for you?
Oh, yes.
But then when you've crossed over, the joy of doing it it's so much different, isn't it, in your relationship with people?
Yeah, well, now I had to be careful of being the fixer of those things.
But she is good at it.
Yeah.
But it's amazing once we did the series.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people knew about our personal family experience around in our communities, but when we did the series in 98,
Yeah.
then the world knew it, and we get phone calls. We have people who turn to us just in the grocery store
Isn't that
and say,
amazing? Yeah.
I think I
need
need to
help."
talk to you.
Can you help me?
Well, this book that you wrote is really terrific because it's a guide. It tells you exactly. At first, it defines what it is. It tells you why you do it, or why you get involved with it, how you feel, and then how you can go to treatment, and then how you stay in recovery. It must be very frustrating to hear the discussions about legalizing drugs and legalizing marijuana.
Especially
What
when
do you
we've
think?
been- well,
Say it.
I could spend the next half an hour. We don't have that much time, but
Right.
it's very frustrating in part because this country has never been able to get its arms around the most used and abused drug in this country that's legal. It's called alcohol. And while lots of people use it responsibly, the people who use it irresponsibly are the ones that cause the havoc. And I don't believe, personally as an addict and alcoholic in recovery, nor does my organization, Hazelden, believe that we should be talking about legalizing any other substances until we can get public policy in lockstep with the realities of this disease as it relates to alcoholism.
Is the relationship between drugs and alcohol, is it very strong?
A drug is a drug is a drug. And anything that affects the mind, the body, and the spirit is something that in the mind and the body, the spirit of some people can affect them in an adverse way. I want to say something else about this book, which makes it very powerful, is that my mother and my father wrote the foreword to the book. And I think that's been really important. I've discovered during my journeys since the book came out that a lot of people, they like what I had to say, but they really hold on to what Judith and Bill say because they are exactly in that same situation that my parents
So
were.
hard. It's so hard. But it must be more infuriating not only to talk about legalizing marijuana, but to spend the millions and millions of dollars we're spending on the border to stop the drugs.
We were down in Arizona recently
Right.
for a memorial service, and there above the mountain that separates Arizona from Mexico were blimps and drones and I don't know how many military people all over the place. And we just said, you know, if we could spend that kind of money on treatment and on education, maybe we wouldn't need this because that's actually a
Right, then you don't have the market for it.
right.
Well, the best way to reduce the demand is to reduce, the best way to reduce the supply is to reduce the demand.
Right.
When I'm a clean and sober guy for 19 years, I'm not demanding those substances anymore, and I'm living a responsible life and following the speed limit and being a taxpayer and raising my kids and trying to do all those things that society expects of us that are impossible when you're under the influence. But when you're clean and sober, anything's possible.
So you go and you do a lot of talking, and Judith, you do too.
I don't do as much as he does, but I do
But you're
when I have an
there.
opportunity because I feel that I owe it to all those people who helped us to say, you know, you can do this. Families can get through this. This is what you need. You might try this. You might try that. As he says, there are many pathways to recovery, and some things work for other people.
Let's just we only have a few minutes. In schools, what are the programs in schools?
Well, they're not good. A lot of schools want to put their head in the sand and believe that they don't have the problem, when in reality, every school's got the problem in one way, shape, or form. I do a lot of speaking in schools, and I tell students my own story and tell them that just because I experimented, just because they experiment doesn't mean they're going to end up like me. But I always leave them with the message I told you earlier, which is that it's okay to ask for help. Look, I had to tell my own kids that I really don't want you to experiment. But if you do, this is what you need to know might happen, and if that happens and you get yourself in a tough situation, it's okay to ask for help.
It's interesting, you know, that very sad thing that happened with the star of Glee, Corey.
Yes.
Corey Moncrief, is that his name? Glee is a very popular program with young people, and it seems to me that's an opportunity somehow to really begin to use that as another way to try to explain to kids that they are going to need help and don't continue going on this path, but
I hope
stop
so.
when you can, right?
Yes, because the alternative to not recovering with this disease ultimately is death.
Death.
Sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. It may be cirrhosis of the liver 30 years from now, maybe an overdose tomorrow afternoon.
And that's what we all worry about, right? As a parents and community.
But on the other side is the fact that families can be restored and that people do recover. And there are thousands and thousands, millions of people, millions of families in this country who are recovering. And it starts with, as we said earlier, personal responsibility and having the resources and the access points to get help.
Well, we certainly find we should have much gratitude for the Moyers family, because you guys are doing a wonderful job. And if every person can grow up and be like you, William Cope, we will be very happy. So read the book. Now what? All the numbers that we give in there, and wish everybody, I guess, to pay attention.
There's always hope.
Thank you. Very good. Thank you both very much.
Thank you, Ronnie.
Is there any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore? Please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.